Hello, I'm Estelle. I'm from University at Albany, State University of New York. The track I'm going to present today is Preference for Harmony, a link between aesthetic responses to combinations of colors and musical tones. In recent years, numerous researches have been conducted to explore the origin of simultaneous consonance. Simultaneous consonance is the tendency for some musical chords to sound more pleasant than others. Studies have found several distinct predictors that contribute to the experience of simultaneous consonance, including roughness, harmonicity, and familiarity. Roughness represents the extent to which a chord's partials interfere with each other. Harmonicity represents the extent to which a chord's frequency spectrum resembles a harmonic series. In addition to the intrinsic predictors of consonance, it has also been demonstrated that an extrinsic feature, the familiarity of a chord, is associated with its consonance. Studies found that people tend to perceive chords they hear more frequently as more consonant. It has been hypothesized that familiarity enhances the chord's processing fluency and thus increases liking. Although substantial progress has been made in understanding the origins of simultaneous consonance, these studies only examine possible predictors within the musical domain. They do not connect the experience of simultaneous consonance to broader aesthetic experience. It is quite possible that consonance judgments of chords are similar to consonance judgments of other types of aesthetic stimuli, such as visual art. A unique study by Palmer and Griscom addressed this issue and found there may be a link between consonance judgments in musical and non-musical domains. They introduced a new individual difference variable, preference for harmony, which they defined as how much a person likes or dislikes stimuli whose parts go well together in the sense of being good gestalts. Palmer presented participants with a range of visual and auditory stimuli and asked them to rate their preference for each stimulus and how harmonious each stimulus was. The visual stimuli included color combinations, dot patterns, and circle in the frame pictures. The auditory stimuli were Western classical piano excerpts. They then calculated PFH scores using the formula that took into account the difference between each participant's preference and harmoniousness ratings. Palmer found that individual PFH scores are strongly correlated across 4 domains, and the correlation is highest with respect to color and music. This means people who prefer harmonious color combinations tend to prefer harmonious music. Assuming that simultaneous consonance judgments are akin to preference ratings, Palmer's finding raises the possibility that PFH represents a generalized aesthetic tendency that influences people's perception of simultaneous consonance. Our study assessed this possibility by conceptually replicating parts of Palmer and Griscom's study. We limited visual stimuli to color pairs because the strongest across-domain PFH correlation was found between the music and color domains. We also replaced Palmer's classical musical excerpts with isolated triads. This mainly allowed us to compute objective features of the musical stimuli, including their roughness, harmonicity, and familiarity. Our study explored how these objective features were associated with subjective harmoniousness judgments and individual differences in PFH. These are the models we use to compute roughness, harmonicity, and familiarity. As we've mentioned before, when there is uncertainty in making harmoniousness judgments, people may have used familiarity as a proxy. If so, preference for harmony may in fact be a preference for familiarity. To address this problem, we used Harrison and Pierce's model to estimate the objective familiarity of each triad by computing the frequency of each triad in the corpus of Western classical, jazz, and popular music. It is important to note that harmonicity and harmoniousness are distinct constructs. Harmoniousness is how the concept of harmony was measured in Palmer's study. It is a perceptual attribute, and it is measured based on subjective participant ratings. On the other hand, harmonicity is an objective property that can be quantified. We used Harrison and Pierce's model to calculate harmonicity. We used the same color stimuli as in the Palmer study. The color stimuli were 56 color pairs consisting of all possible color combinations from the red, yellow, blue, and green hues in light and saturated cuts. Below are two examples. The left one is relatively high in harmoniousness rating and the right one is relatively low. The chords were 44 Western 12-tone equal-tempered triads, each with a bass note of C4. They were randomly selected from 66 possible triads within the span of an octave. These two graphs are scatter plots of average harmoniousness versus preference ratings. The left graph is for color combinations and the right graph is for musical chords. We found that zero autocorrelations between preference and harmoniousness ratings were high for both color pairs and musical chords. This is consistent with Palmer and Griscom's findings. These two graphs are histograms of correlations between each participant's harmoniousness and preference ratings. The left one is for color combinations and the right one is for musical chords. Similar to Palmer and Griscom's original results, there is great variability in individuals' correlation between preference and harmoniousness ratings. This explains how there can be individual differences in PFH. The correlation between PFH for the color combinations and musical chords was 0.63. This closely replicates Palmer's correlation between color combinations and classical music excerpts, which finds a correlation of 0.6. Next, we use the three objective musical properties, harmonicity, roughness, and familiarity, to predict subjective harmoniousness. We found that objective harmonicity was not a significant predictor of subjective harmoniousness ratings. Instead, roughness and familiarity uniquely contributed to subjective harmoniousness, with roughness being a most robust predictor. Finally, we regressed musical PFH on preference for harmonicity, smoothness, and familiarity. Results show that PFH was uniquely associated with a preference for smoothness. One potential limitation of experiment 1 was that we used a corpus-based measure of chord familiarity. It is possible that people's subjective perception of a chord's familiarity better indicates its processing fluency, so that subjective familiarity may be a stronger predictor of subjective harmoniousness and PFH. To evaluate this possibility, we conducted a second experiment. In experiment 2, we removed the color stimuli and only presented participants with musical chords. We used the same set of 44 musical triads as in experiment 1. We added a subjective familiarity rating block at the beginning of the study, and we asked participants to rate how common each chord was. Experiment 2 replicated the results of experiment 1, except for the multiple regression analysis that uses ad hoc individual difference measures to predict PFH. In experiment 1, we found that preference for smoothness was a significant predictor of PFH scores. However, experiment 2 showed that none of the individual difference measures was independently associated with PFH, and the omnibus F-test for the regression was not significant, suggesting a poor model fit. So additional research is required to corroborate the finding. We then replaced objective familiarity with subjective familiarity. We regressed subjective harmoniousness on harmonicity, roughness, and subjective familiarity. We found that subjective familiarity was a significant predictor, and there was a marginally reliable main effect of roughness. This result was comparable to the results using objective familiarity. However, subjective familiarity is more predictive of subjective harmoniousness ratings than the objective familiarity measure. Next, we replaced preference for objective familiarity with preference for subjective familiarity, and we regressed PFH on the ad hoc individual difference measures. This analysis did reveal a significant effect of preference for subjective familiarity. It raised the possibility that preference for harmony may actually be a preference for familiar stimuli instead of a preference for stimuli that are intrinsically harmonious. To conclude, using a distinct set of musical stimuli, we conceptually replicated and extended Palmer and Griscom's results by showing that PFH for color combinations was strongly correlated with PFH for judgments of the pleasantness of musical chords. Our study supports Palmer and Griscom's contention that PFH represents a generalized tendency that contributes to aesthetic preference judgments across domains. More importantly, our study provides the first evidence that PFH can help explain variance in simultaneous consonants. Our study also sheds light on some of the variables that contribute or fail to contribute to PFH. Notably, we newly found that subjective harmoniousness was driven by chords' roughness and familiarity, both objective and subjective, but not their objective harmonicity. That is all for my talk today. Thank you so much.